What happens when sharp political strategy collides with unwavering experience? In one unforgettable congressional hearing, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into the spotlight, armed with confidence, determined to put Senator John Kennedy on the defensive. But what unfolded was not the verbal victory she expected. Instead, it became a masterclass in calm, factual reasoning that left the chamber silent and millions watching in disbelief. This wasn't just another heated exchange on Capitol Hill. It was a moment that captured the essence of political debate in today's divided America, a clash between quick-witted performance and steady conviction. And it left one thing absolutely clear. Sometimes the person who speaks with fewer words leaves the strongest mark. Imagine a crowded hearing room, cameras rolling, reporters ready to dissect every word, and politicians prepared to turn a simple question into a viral headline. And in the middle of it all stood AOC, sharp, confident, and determined to prove her point. Across from her sat Senator Kennedy, known for his plain-spoken style, his sharp humor, and his ability to cut through noise with a single sentence. The atmosphere was tense. The stakes were high, and every viewer sensed they were about to witness something unforgettable. The opening moments set the tone. AOC pushed forward with rapid fire, questioning designed to corner the senator, but Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her words, dissected the assumptions, and delivered responses that carried both weight and clarity. And what began as an attempt to unsettle him turned into an opportunity for Kennedy to show why experience and composure often win against theatrics. The power of this exchange lies not only in what was said, but in how it was said. Kennedy's steady voice contrasted with AOC's pressing tone, and while her strategy relied on speed and intensity, his strength came from science and precision. Each answer was clear, each point grounded, and soon the audience began to realize that the senator wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the entire moment around. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens because they weren't just watching a debate, they were watching a real-time demonstration of how facts and calm reasoning can cut through noise. And in that moment, the story shifted, no longer about AOC's challenge, but about Kennedy's unexpected command of the conversation. And this is why this moment matters, because beyond the headlines and the sound bites, it revealed something deeper about leadership in Washington. It showed that true influence isn't built on volume or speed, but on clarity, composure, and conviction. And in a time when public trust in government is fragile, this kind of steady, grounded exchange stands out. By the time the opening round ended, the hearing room felt different. The confidence with which AOC entered had met the quiet strength of Kennedy's responses, and instead of a moment of triumph for her, it became a reminder that experience still has power in politics, a reminder that facts delivered with calm conviction can silence even the sharpest of challenges, and that a single moment of clarity can echo far beyond the walls of Congress. To understand why this exchange between AOC and Senator John Kennedy captured so much attention, we need to step back and look at the history that brought both of these figures to this moment, because without that background, the significance of what unfolded might not be fully clear. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, often referred to simply as AOC, first rose to national attention in 2018 when she won a surprising primary victory in New York's 14th congressional district, defeating a longtime Democratic incumbent. Her campaign was driven by grassroots energy, progressive ideals, and a style that connected with younger voters and online audiences, and very quickly she became one of the most visible figures in Congress. AOC's presence has always been marked by her ability to frame debates in sharp, often viral soundbites. She's known for using hearings as platforms to spotlight issues she cares about, and her approach often blends policy with performance, which appeals strongly to her base, but sometimes draws criticism from her opponents who argue that style comes at the expense of substance. Senator John Kennedy, on the other hand, represents a very different political path. He has served Louisiana for years and built his reputation on plain-spoken honesty, sharp humor, and an ability to cut through complicated issues with simple, memorable lines, while AOC represents a younger, more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Kennedy embodies a traditional conservative approach rooted in Southern pragmatism and wit, and his strength often lies not in volume but in the quiet delivery of phrases that stick long after the hearing is over. This contrast in background and style is what made their interaction so striking, because from the start it was clear that AOC's approach would rely on speed, pressure, and control of the narrative, while Kennedy's defense would rely on steadiness, patience, and clear facts delivered at the right moment. The hearing itself took place in the broader context of ongoing debates in Congress over issues ranging from economic policy to oversight responsibilities. In recent years, congressional hearings have increasingly become stages not only for policy making but also for public performance, with politicians aware that every line might be clipped, shared, and spread online. Within minutes, AOC has mastered this environment, frequently turning hearings into viral moments that energize her supporters and spark debates across media platforms. Her questioning style often pushes witnesses or colleagues into uncomfortable positions designed to highlight contradictions or expose weaknesses, and in many cases that tactic has worked in her favor. Kennedy, however, has never been one to rush into defensive postures. Instead, he leans on his experience, legal training, and deliberate pace to let his opponent's arguments unfold before responding in a way that feels both grounded and memorable. He understands that hearings are as much about tone as they are about words, and he uses that understanding to maintain control even under pressure. It's also important to recognize that by the time of this particular exchange, both AOC and Kennedy had already developed strong public images that shaped how viewers perceived them. Supporters of AOC expected her to dominate and deliver sharp blows, while supporters of Kennedy expected him to hold his ground and perhaps even turn the tables. This dynamic raised the stakes because the clash wasn't just between two individuals, it was between two distinct political identities that represented very different audiences and very different visions for the country. The hearing room itself added to the drama. Congressional chambers are designed not only for governance but also for spectacle, with rows of members, attentive staffers, cameras at every angle, and journalists waiting to interpret every move in that environment. The smallest gesture can be amplified, the subtlest pause can feel dramatic, and the tone of one exchange can shift the narrative of an entire session. By the time AOC began her questioning, the context was already set. A young rising star with a reputation for sharpness was facing off against an experienced senator with a reputation for resilience, and both of them knew that what happened in those moments could echo beyond the hearing and into the national conversation. That's why this moment resonated so strongly. It wasn't simply about one question and one answer, it was about two approaches to leadership colliding in real time. One side pushed with speed and confidence, the other answered with patience and precision, and viewers across the country recognized that this wasn't just politics as usual, it was a deeper demonstration of how style, strategy, and substance interact in the modern era of American government. The clash between AOC and Senator Kennedy didn't come out of nowhere. It grew out of a moment when questions of transparency, accountability, and decision-making in government were already under intense scrutiny. AOC came into the hearing with a clear strategy to use her rapid-fire questioning style to highlight inconsistencies, push the senator into a defensive corner, and demonstrate to her supporters that she could outmaneuver a seasoned lawmaker. From the start, her tone was sharp and assertive, signaling that she intended to dominate the exchange. She began with a series of pointed questions, each designed less to seek an open answer and more to frame Kennedy into narrow responses that could be interpreted as admissions. Her questions were layered fast and delivered with confidence, the kind of approach that often overwhelms witnesses or colleagues unprepared for the pace. For a brief moment, it seemed like AOC might succeed in controlling the narrative, but then Kennedy responded, and the entire room felt the shift. Kennedy's first answers weren't rushed, they weren't defensive. Instead, they were calm, measured, and filled with context to had reframed the questions rather than being trapped by the structure AOC had set. He slowed the pace, reminded listeners of the broader facts, and turned the exchange from an interrogation into a conversation, one in which he now held the stronger hand. Viewers could sense the transition almost instantly. AOC's tone grew sharper, her interruptions more frequent, because she realized that Kennedy was not only refusing to be cornered, but was also exposing the weaknesses in her framing. Where she expected quick, flustered answers, she was met with clarity and precision, and those qualities began to stand out more than the questions themselves. This was the scandal in miniature, not about personal misconduct or political corruption, but about the perception of control and credibility. In one of the most public forums in government, AOC had built her brand on being able to command such moments. But in this case, the attempt to outsmart Kennedy backfired, not because her questions lacked sharpness, but because his responses carried weight that her strategy couldn't dislodge. The more she pressed, the more composed he seemed, and that contrast played powerfully for those watching. At one key moment, Kennedy delivered a line that stopped the momentum cold without raising his voice, without resorting to theatrics. He pointed out a simple fact that undercut the premise of her argument. The hearing room grew quiet, because in that instant the audience recognized that the advantage had shifted. What was meant to be a display of AOC's dominance had turned into a demonstration of Kennedy's steadiness. This wasn't just a battle of words, it was a battle of presence, and Kennedy's ability to remain unshaken highlighted the limits of a strategy built solely on speed and force. For many observers, that moment became the scandal, not because rules were broken, but because expectations were shattered. AOC's attempt to secure Elvira Elwyn had collided with an opponent who refused to play by the script, and instead of leaving Kennedy scrambling the exchange, left her struggling to regain control. Commentators quickly picked up on the dynamic. Media outlets noted the unusual turn, pointing out that while AOC had landed strong moments in past hearings here, she had encountered resistance she could not easily dismiss. Social media users dissected the clip, some praising her effort, but many highlighting Kennedy's restraint and ability to cut through with plain facts. The narrative shifted rapidly from anticipation of another AOC highlight reel to recognition of Kennedy's unexpected command of the stage. For AOC, this moment carried risks because so much of her influence relies on maintaining an image of dominance in such public confrontations. For Kennedy, however, the moment reinforced his reputation as someone who could cut through noise with calm conviction. That's why this exchange mattered. It wasn't simply about two politicians sparring. It was about the perception of strength, credibility, and leadership in the eyes of the public. Once the scandal broke, it became clear that the story wasn't AOC's attempt to outsmart Kennedy, but Kennedy's ability to remain composed and turn the entire interaction into a statement about patience, facts, and experience. This marked the beginning of a broader narrative that would only build in the sections that followed, because as viewers and commentators returned to the exchange, they saw more than just sharp questions and steady answers. They saw a deeper reflection of how political battles are fought and won in the modern era. Once the initial exchange between AOC and Senator Kennedy set the tone, the hearing moved into a deeper phase where evidence, examples, and supporting details came into play, and this is where the contrast between their approaches became even more striking. AOC leaned heavily on documents, statistics, and reports she had prepared. Her strategy was to layer one piece of information on top of another, to build pressure and create the appearance of mountain. contradictions in Kennedy's position. She cited studies, referenced committee records, and quoted past statements with the clear intent of overwhelming him with volume, believing that the more she piled on, the harder it would be for him to respond effectively. Kennedy, however, approached this escalation in a completely different manner. Instead of being rattled by the speed and density of the information, he carefully unpacked each point, focusing not on matching her pace, but on clarifying the key issue hidden within the flood of details. When presented with statistics, he asked where the numbers came from and whether they told the full story. When confronted with selective quotes, he calmly provided the broader context, showing that what sounded sharp in isolation often looked different when placed back into the full record. This back and forth created a rhythm that audiences found fascinating to watch. On one side was AOC, confident and relentless, pushing forward with energy and determination. On the other side was Kennedy, calm and deliberate, dismantling each layer of evidence piece by piece. The clash wasn't just about facts. It was about how those facts were delivered, interpreted, and used to shape perception. The escalation reached a particularly notable point when AOC attempted to connect Kennedy to a broader pattern of decision-making she argued reflected inconsistency. She laid out a series of past votes and statements, presenting them as proof of contradiction. It was a tactic she had used successfully in the past against other lawmakers, where the accumulation of detail created the appearance of a pattern too strong to ignore. But Kennedy did not allow the narrative to settle in her favor. With steady confidence, he explained the context behind each decision, reminding listeners that complex issues rarely reduce to a single sentence or vote. His responses weren't defensive, they were explanatory, giving the impression of a senator who understood not only his record but also the principles guiding it. This ability to bring clarity in the midst of mounting evidence transformed the tone of the hearing. What had begun as AOC's attempt to trap Kennedy in contradictions instead became an opportunity for him to highlight his consistency and reasoning. Viewers who expected to see him caught off guard instead witnessed a methodical demonstration of how experience and patience could withstand even the sharpest interrogation. The mini cliffhanger of this section emerged when Kennedy, after calmly responding to multiple layers of AOC's evidence, leaned in and made a statement that reframed the entire discussion. Without raising his voice, he reminded the committee and the audience that evidence only has meaning when viewed with full context, and that selectively using numbers or quotes without acknowledging the bigger picture does not reveal truth, but rather distorts it. The weight of that statement hung in the room, and for a moment even AOC seemed to pause, realizing that the foundation of her strategy had been directly challenged. The tension in the room built as people watching wondered whether she could recover momentum. But the impression had already been made. Kennedy had managed to turn her greatest strength, the ability to escalate with detail, into a demonstration of his own resilience and clarity. For audiences outside the chamber, this part of the exchange became one of the most widely discussed because it highlighted not just what was said, but how it was handled. In the modern political arena, where information overload is common, Kennedy showed that steady focus and context could neutralize even the most aggressive barrage of evidence. And in doing so, he not only held his ground, but left viewers questioning whether AOC's approach, while sharp, had actually advanced her argument or simply exposed the limits of a strategy built on speed and pressure. As the exchange deepened, the conversation began to shift from a personal clash between two lawmakers to something much larger, because Kennedy recognized that the debate wasn't only about who looked sharper in the moment, but about exposing how arguments are built, how narratives are shaped, and how the broader system often gets pulled into framing these political battles. When AOC pressed forward with her questions, she wasn't just challenging Kennedy directly, she was also appealing to the broader public conversation, attempting to frame him as part of a political establishment out of step with newer voices. And while this framing resonated with some, Kennedy's response made it clear that the issues went beyond personality or party. They touched on how facts, context, and governance intersect. Kennedy began pointing out that the real challenge facing Congress was not a lack of energy or passion, but a lack of consistency and accountability, because while fiery exchanges could dominate headlines, they often did little to create lasting solutions for the people watching at home. He used the opportunity to explain how selective narratives, when repeated often enough, distort public understanding and create divisions that distract from solving real problems. This was the point where the discussion moved from an individual back and forth into an indictment of a system that too often rewards style over substance. Kennedy emphasized that the American people deserve more than moments crafted for social media clips. They deserve leaders who engage with the full weight of evidence, who recognize complexity, and who prioritize outcomes over optics. The more he leaned into this point, the clearer it became that he was broadening the scope of the conversation, turning the spotlight not only on AOC's tactics, but also on the way political institutions had become arenas for performance. The audience could sense the shift. What began as a debate between TDU personalities was now pulling back the curtain on the entire system, and this gave Kennedy's words a heavier impact. He described how issues such as oversight, transparency, and accountability were often undermined by partisanship and performance, and he highlighted the cost of this approach in terms of public trust, wasted resources, and stalled progress. For those watching, this wasn't just a clash of individuals anymore. It was a reminder of the stakes involved when lawmakers focus more on winning the moment than on addressing the real challenges their constituents face. The weight of this section grew when Kennedy began pointing to specific examples of how the system had failed to deliver, because debates like this one often stopped at surface level sound bites instead of diving into meaningful solutions. He underscored how misrepresenting evidence, cherry picking facts, or focusing on short term wins ultimately weakens the institution of Congress itself. And while AOC continued to push her strategy, Kennedy's responses exposed the limitations of an approach built around quick victories. In doing so, he not only defended himself, but positioned the exchange as a reflection of a larger cultural and political issue. By this point, even those who entered the debate sympathetic to AOC's tactics could see that Kennedy had shifted the terrain, because instead of arguing only on her terms, he had elevated the conversation to address something far broader and more consequential. His tone remained steady, his words measured, and his focus consistent, reinforcing the impression that he wasn't simply reacting, but rather leading the discussion into territory that mattered more. This section reached its most striking moment when Kennedy summarized the problem in plain terms: that democracy suffers when leaders treat hearings as performances rather than responsibilities, and that integrity requires patience, context, and a willingness to confront complexity even when it doesn't fit neatly into a headline. The silence in the room after those words was telling, because what he was saying resonated beyond the immediate clash. It echoed into the larger question of how politics operates today. For viewers, this shift from the individual to the systemic was both sobering and refreshing. It gave weight to the idea that while personal rivalries make for compelling television, the real test of leadership is the ability to resist shortcuts, resist distortion, and resist the temptation to trade substance for spectacle. Kennedy's calm dismantling of not only AOC's argument, but also the culture that enables such exchanges exposed a deeper truth. The system itself needed reflection, reform, and renewed commitment to its original purpose, and by positioning himself as the one willing to make that argument, he ensured that this moment would not just be remembered as a clash with a single congresswoman, but as a turning point in the larger conversation about how America's leaders conduct themselves in the halls of power. The tension that had been building throughout the hearing finally reached its peak, and everyone in the room could feel the shift. AOC, determined to regain control of the exchange, leaned forward with her sharpest line of questioning, yet the kind designed not only to challenge Kennedy, but to leave him cornered in front of cameras and colleagues. She framed her argument as though she had found the one inconsistency that would unravel his composure, delivering her words quickly and confidently, convinced that this was the turning point in her favor. For a brief moment, the energy in the chamber tilted toward her because her tone carried urgency and her phrasing suggested finality. Viewers at home likely expected Kennedy to stumble or at least hesitate, but instead of flinching, Kennedy met her intensity with steady calm. He allowed her to finish, paused just long enough to let the silence settle, and then delivered a response that shifted the entire atmosphere. His words were sharp but measured, delivered with precision, and each sentence carried the weight of someone who had been through countless debates before and knew exactly when to press forward. Rather than denying or deflecting, he reframed the issue entirely, taking her accusation and turning it into an opportunity to highlight principles that cut deeper than the immediate question. In that instant, the room fell quiet because the expected clash had turned into something much more decisive. Kennedy reminded everyone present that public service is not about winning arguments for cameras, but about maintaining trust, consistency, and accountability. His phrasing was simple but powerful, and it struck at the heart of the exchange. Leadership is not proven by speed or spectacle, but by substance and clarity. The impact of his words could be seen in the faces of those watching. Staffers shifted uncomfortably, reporters scribbled notes furiously, and even AOC herself, usually unshaken in debate, hesitated before preparing her next move. What had been intended as a moment of triumph for her became the very moment that defined Kennedy's command of the hearing. This was the turning point, the climax that left no doubt about where the momentum now rested. Kennedy's response wasn't loud or theatrical, it was rooted in calm certainty, and because of that, it carried more force than any raised voice could have. He ended with a statement that resonated far beyond the room. Facts don't need volume, they need clarity, and the American people deserve clarity every single time. That single line echoed like a gavel, closing the argument in a way that was impossible to ignore. The silence that followed told the story better than any commentary could. In that moment, Kennedy had not only responded to AOC's challenge, he had turned the entire hearing into a demonstration of how composure and conviction can shut down even the sharpest attacks. For viewers across the country, this was the scene that would be replayed, quoted, and remembered. It was the peak of the confrontation, the moment that cemented the exchange as more than a routine clash in Congress. It had become a defining reminder that in politics, as in life, calm clarity can be the sharpest response of all. After the climax of the exchange, the hearing did not return to business as usual. Kennedy's words lingered in the air, reshaping the tone of the discussion. What had started as a heated confrontation now shifted into reflection, with colleagues and viewers alike considering what the moment revealed about leadership and responsibility. AOC, though quick to adjust her stance, could not erase the impact of Kennedy's steady response. The energy in the room had changed, and everyone knew it. From that moment forward, the discussion moved beyond point scoring and into the question of what real reform looks like. Kennedy used the momentum wisely. Rather than pressing his advantage for spectacle, he steered the focus toward broader accountability. He emphasized that hearings like these were not meant to showcase political theater, but to uncover facts and produce outcomes that mattered to everyday citizens. This shift was subtle but powerful. It reminded listeners that beyond the clash of personalities, the ultimate purpose was to safeguard trust in government and ensure that systems worked fairly for all. In the days that followed, this exchange became a touchstone. Media outlets replayed the moment not only to highlight Kennedy's command, but also to spark conversations about the deeper issues at stake. Commentators noted that his composure served as an example of how leaders could rise above partisan clashes and instead redirect energy toward constructive solutions. Citizens who tuned in saw more than just a shutdown, they saw a call for reform framed in real terms that connected with their concerns. The immediate reform discussions centered around transparency. Kennedy's insistence on clarity struck a chord, leading to renewed attention on how hearings are conducted, how information is presented, and how accountability measures are enforced. Lawmakers from both sides quietly acknowledged that the exchange had raised the bar. If a single moment could cut through noise and demand better standards, then perhaps broader reforms were not only possible but necessary. For Kennedy, this was not about personal victory. He framed his message around the principle that the American people deserve honesty without spin facts, without distortion, and leadership without theatrics. This approach resonated because it addressed a frustration shared by many, the feeling that political debates often generate more heat than light. By turning the spotlight toward reform, he gave viewers a reason to believe that meaningful change could still be achieved through steady commitment rather than grandstanding. The reforms discussed extended beyond rhetoric. Proposals surfaced for clearer reporting requirements, stronger checks on partisan framing, and improved accessibility of public hearings so citizens could engage directly with information rather than rely solely on filtered commentary. These ideas gained traction because they tied directly back to the core lesson of the exchange. Clarity is not just a style of debate, it is the foundation of accountability. The long-term resolution of this moment was not measured by headlines alone, but by the renewed sense of expectation it created. Viewers expected more from their representatives, not only in how they argued, but in how they governed. The Kennedy AOC exchange had demonstrated that sharp words fade quickly, but a clear call for reform resonates far longer. By the time the dust settled, the hearing had become more than a clash between two strong personalities. It had been transformed into a catalyst for reflection and change. Kennedy's response shut down a single attack in the moment, but more importantly, it opened the door to conversations about systemic reform, conversations that extended far beyond the walls of Congress. And that, in the end, was the true resolution. The clash had given way to clarity, and clarity had pointed the way toward lasting accountability. When the hearing ended and the cameras stopped rolling, the moment between John Kennedy and AOC had already taken on a life of its own. People across the country replayed the exchange not simply because of its sharpness,